So you do have that power. You are also being recorded right now. So we have 146 people currently on ready to watch Professor Conger talk about persuasion, but we have another 100 or 200 that couldn't make it for whatever reason, whether it's work or family opportunities. And we will put this on our virtual library. You go to cmc.edu/alumni or cmc.edu/parents. We have a virtual library where we store all of these for viewing down the line. So feel free to join us for this program in the future or any other program that we've had at this point. My name is Evan Rudder. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Alumni and Parent Engagement at Claremont McKenna, also an alumnus of the college. Today is June 30. Today is the last day of our calendar year, of our fiscal year for the college. So you'll notice lots of emails and texts and phone communications. Our advancement team, our development officers are working on bringing in as many final donors before the end of our fiscal year. And we are currently 125 short of our goal. If you haven't yet made a donation at CMC, please go to cmc.edu/donate. Whatever amount you can. I know this is a difficult time for many, whether it's $5 or $20.20 in honor of our recent graduating class. Any amount helps. So appreciate it and thank you. A couple of brief things about Zoom. You'll notice at the bottom there's a chat feature and a participant feature. If you click on either of those, they'll pop open to the right. In the participant section, you'll see 156 of alumni and parents there and staff members. There's a special button at the bottom of that that says raise hand. If you want to raise your hand and speak directly with Professor Conger, you are welcome to do that. We'll unmute you as appropriate. Excuse me. Also, in the chat feature, you'll notice that a lot of people are putting their name, their parent year, their class year into the chat field. Please do that if you haven't. It's kind of fun to see where everyone's from. And then also we will be able to you'll be able to insert questions in there when it comes to the Q&A section of our talk in a little bit. So you can either raise your hand and ask a question or make a comment or put it directly into the chat. Also, the top right, there is speaker view or grid view. I recommend speaker view so that you can see whomever is speaking during the session. Grid view allows you to see a lot of different people who are here, and it's kind of personal preference. Professor Conger will be sharing his screen shortly, so don't be surprised when all of a sudden your screen does change, as that is absolutely completely normal. It's now my pleasure to turn over to Professor Conger. He is the Henry R. Kravis Research Chair in Leadership Studies in the Department of Psychology, and of course works very closely with the Kravis Leadership Institute. And today he's talking about the art of persuasion. Professor Conger, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Evan. Hi, everyone. Nice to see most of you. I'm going to begin with a favorite expression of mine, which is the limits on your words are the limits on your influence. And many years ago, I became interested in people who were change agents. And these were individuals in large, complex organizations who were driving innovations or major change initiatives. And they were quite successful. And so the question I was wrestling with is, what gave these individuals the capacity to bring about relatively radical changes in large organizations? They were rarely at the top of those organizations. And as I began to examine what they did so well, I zeroed in on persuasion. And I started to realize that persuasion was essential to any change agent's toolkit. And what I'm going to share with you is basically kind of a lifelong curiosity about the role of language and persuasion in influence. I want to begin by saying, though, that there are two fundamental disconnects when we come to this topic of persuasion. The first is that we associate it with selling. And in a way, while it is an essential part of good selling, as if you might go down to a car dealership and buy yourself a new car or buy a home, by being associated just with that field and with politics as the other field, we fail to value the fact that it's actually going on all day long in our lives. So later this evening, you may convince someone at home that tonight's the night to have hamburgers or sushi. You won't even call it persuasion. You will call it making a decision about what to eat. This whole hour with me is based on persuasion. I'm going to persuade you to think differently about the activity of persuasion, and I'm going to give you some tools to make you more persuasive. But by the way, you could decide that those tools are of little value, in which case I wasn't very persuasive during this hour. So most of the activities that you would call conversations or sharing a point of view, or a term in organizations we call aligning people or enrolling people, those are all acts of persuasion. Almost all of going to college and sitting in a college classroom is one long act of persuasion. So it's an everyday occurrence, and it takes up a large portion of your day. As a result, actually, we treat it very casually. And so the other big disconnect I'm going to share with you is the gap between what we think we need to do to be persuasive and how we actually prepare in reality. I want to begin, though, by saying, well, what is persuasion? So persuasion is your ability, my ability, to present a point of view that leads other individuals to willingly support that point of view. So if I'm successful this hour, I'm going to be sharing with you some insights, some research on persuasion. And if you agree with my point of view, you'll actually start doing some things differently. If you don't, well, I failed at the art of persuasion. In organizations and leadership, the ultimate test of persuasion is that people actually do something. So you've all been in meetings where everybody around the table shook their head in agreement, very good idea, like that, and nothing happened. So that's a failure of persuasion. The champion, for whatever reason, didn't do enough homework or didn't think through the issue carefully. And I would argue, if you look at most organizations and you look at most meetings in organizations, you will see scattered throughout the day important failures of persuasion. And sometimes those failures have grave consequences. The minivan, which basically was the fastest growing car category for almost 2 full decades, was the original idea of a young designer at General Motors. He couldn't convince the head designer about this idea. And so it was another individual, Fergus Pollock at Chrysler, who was a more savvy champion of innovation, who actually got Chrysler to launch the idea. But the idea actually was at General Motors 2 years prior to Chrysler. And GM could have actually been the owner and champion of this minivan. The personal computer was actually championed by 2 groups, one at Xerox Research Park, and the other was an engineer at Intel. Neither of those organizations had sufficient, shall we say, persuasive champions. And so Stephen Jobs actually launched the first significant personal computer. So I always like to say, look around, ask yourself, are ideas dying in my organization? And what you will conclude is they're actually dying at a fairly fast rate, in part because the champions have not thought about their persuasion and how they're going to roll individuals in the actual act of engagement and then ultimately implementing an idea. So all that's a background to say it's worth investing in this activity. Now, I would say that persuasion will not always work. It is not a foolproof tool. Those of you who have teenagers know that negotiations is the best you can hope for. And many of those of you in large organizations know there are political forces, there are people who've already made up their mind. And so there are limits to persuasion. But I want to highlight, again, going back to this idea of champions and bringing about change, the absolute critical role that each of us has to be masterful at this activity. I'm going to tell you a little story about a man named, and here he is. His name is Ignaz Semmelweis. He was a 19th century Hungarian physician. He worked in the Viennese hospital in the maternity ward, and he made a discovery that's particularly relevant today. He discovered a practice of hygiene that today every physician and every nurse actually practices, which is washing your hands. Now, the irony of his insight and the irony of his discovery is that very few people actually put it into practice while he was alive. What he discovered was that if you washed your hands, it basically neutralized or washed off everyday germs. And the reason why he made this discovery was that he was working, as I mentioned, in a maternity clinic. And what he discovered was that the wards, which were staffed by physicians and medical students, had up to 18% of the new mothers delivering babies dying from a mysterious illness which was called childbed fever. On the other hand, there was a ward literally next door to this ward that was staffed by midwives, and there only 2% of the women died of this fever. And so the question is, well, why was there such an extreme discrepancy between the two wards? Well, Semmelweis decided he would find out why. And what he discovered was that the physicians, before they would deliver babies, were often working on cadavers in another area of the hospital, as they were learning basically surgery procedures and also doing their own research. And what they were doing is they were actually carrying the germs from the cadavers over to the women and infecting them with this fever that ultimately killed them. He discovered that the midwives, because they were not working on cadavers, didn't have this transmission through their hands. And so he began to urge his colleagues simply to wash their hands. Now, that actually took a long time because, one, the doctors could not imagine that they might have a much higher infection rate than the midwives. So that was a big hurdle to override. The second thing is the popular belief at the time was that germs were spread through the air by toxic odors, and it was called the miasma theory. And Semmelweis's idea flew completely against that notion, that somehow your hands might transmit these tiny microbes which were invisible. The paradox of this is that almost no one listened to him, except for a few of his colleagues in the maternity ward who began to realize that he was onto something. And the reason people didn't listen to him is, in addition to kind of challenging the paradigms of the time, he was a very gruff, very dogmatic individual. He did not speak German well, and German was the primary language at medical conferences in that part of Europe. And so he rarely attended conferences, and his style completely lacked in persuasion. As a result, it was only after his death that his idea would take ground and traction. So I highlight that because oftentimes we feel that we have a very important idea, we have a very important insight, and everybody should just get behind us. Can't they see how brilliant this is, or how much experience I have, or how much expertise? So one of the issues which I'm going to talk about is that persuasion at its heart is not a monologue. We often think of this because we think of persuasion in a venture pitch or something like that. But even there, you'll see that it's more of a conversation. One of my favorite exercises to do is to ask individuals to pair up in a classroom and persuade their partner where to go for their next vacation. Well, what you'll see is that about 95% of the individuals immediately begin selling you on some beautiful tropical island or some wonderful place in Normandy where you can get some great cheese or some wonderful biking, and they fall into pitch mode. There's about 5% of the room who actually begin by asking their partner, what do they look for in a vacation? What are the things that are most meaningful for them? What do they find least interesting about a vacation? What would they avoid? It's that 5% who end up successfully persuading their partners. The other 95% have a hit or miss rate, and generally it looks like, from my perspective, about 15%, almost by accident, land on a vacation that their partner wants to go to. So probably the number one mistake is not understanding that it's a conversation. And then with a conversation goes homework. I think number two is our own ego. We're often very invested in our ideas, our points of view. And it's important to step back and realize that you're going to be contested on that. The third is that we often prepare very informally. I like to joke that if you have an important meeting coming up that day, you're going to start in the shower and you're going to try to multitask at the same time as you're thinking through your issue. You'll then get in your car pre-pandemic and you'll begin rehearsing in your mind what you want to say at that meeting. You'll then walk down the hallway to your office, remember those days, and you'll be rehearsing there. You'll notice that your partner throughout all of this is you. You're basically speaking to yourself. And I would ask you, how many of you like your ideas? Well, I'm going to guess 100% of us do. The other thing is the failure to really understand what I'll call the killer questions. So in your audience are a few individuals who are going to ask you some very difficult questions. And I'm shocked at how few people have anticipated these questions in advance. And so you end up getting caught off guard and stumbling and not having done your homework to answer those. There's another common mistake, which is understanding that there are political issues in the background, and there are individuals who have no interest in supporting your point of view. And if you haven't done your homework relative to those factors, your timing and approach may lead you to failure. One of my probably most effective persuaders, he was a very successful change agent. In the middle of my research, he said to me, Jay, with serious issues that I'm persuading, I literally spend about 90% of my time listening and 10% of my time talking. And while that probably seems like an extreme 90-10, the best persuaders I've met do spend an enormous proportion of their time just in the act of listening. I was interviewing somebody yesterday for a new book I'm going to be writing on persuasion. And his name is Mark. And I said, Mark, tell me how you're going to undertake this issue. He's trying to bring about a radical shift in the organization, moving the organization away from its cash cow, its primary business, which is in slow decline. And he said, well, what I do is I go to a couple people who are naturally going to be resistant, but people who are very open-minded, and I spend a lot of time asking them questions. And I'm going to learn from them kind of what will be the salient points which will get them ultimately to support a change initiative. So with that as background, the fact that actually this is such a critical skill, if you look around, you'll see that people are stumbling right and left. Paradoxically, almost none of us have ever had a course on persuasion. We've had courses on negotiations, which is a different activity. It actually partners often with persuasion, but it's about kind of moving, trading back and forth and compromising. So what I want to focus on today is offering you a simple framework to think about this critical influence tactic called persuasion around 4 different dimensions. So imagine there you are, you're in front of a group, you have an important initiative you want them to support. You have 10 minutes to offer that and convince them to get behind you. Here's what will happen. You'll begin, and in the first 30 seconds, the audience will make a decision of whether or not you are credible on this issue. And by the way, it's going to be about 30 seconds. They'll say, okay, they've done their homework. They seem to be objective. They've taken into consideration the issues here, I'll give them a hearing. So what credibility does is it gets you a hearing, but that's it. Now, 1 to 2 minutes into sharing, they're deciding, is this issue really relevant to me and my group and my team and my organization? And there they're wrestling with, is this issue something that I can understand in my framing? And what the persuader is doing here is showing there is common ground, that the issue I'm persuading you about is useful and meaningful to you, the listener. Now they're going to move into a third stage, which is, does this issue connect to me on an emotional level? Do I feel I need to get behind this? And this is what we call the emotional connection. Now, paradoxically, it often comes before kind of the rational side of us makes decisions. And there's been an enormous amount of research done in the area of neuropsychology, which shows that the brain makes decisions first emotionally and then follows with rationality. And that brings us to the last part of persuasion, which is, am I rationally convinced by this person's arguments and evidence? And therefore, with my connection to this issue emotionally and these rational arguments, I'll now act. So those are the 4 phases that an audience goes through, and you have to be able to address each of them. So the first is credibility. Are you credible? So I probably had a fair amount of credibility. Evan was kind enough to call me a professor. And I'm associated with an institution that has tremendous credibility, particularly with each of us in this webinar. The common ground issue, you probably said to yourself, well, will Jay's talk be relevant to me? Can I use any of this? And you'll notice that I've linked it back to being influential and how you navigate and get your ideas and initiatives and change effective. Hopefully you're starting to get a little bit of an emotional connection. In large part, I would argue, partly through the enthusiasm I'm conveying, but also potentially through the story I shared with Semmelweis. And you begin to see the potentially, I mean, he's a failure as a champion because he couldn't mobilize people in the face of this issue of needing to wash hands. As you'll see, I'll go along and I'll make some very hopefully compelling arguments as to why you and I need to be particularly skillful. But part of the arguments I'm making for you is through your own experience. So you're thinking about the times you probably succeeded or failed at persuasion. You're thinking about my description of how your brain operates when it's being persuaded. And you're benchmarking and saying, you know, those seem to have some credibility. Well, let's begin with credibility because it's the door and you want it as wide open as possible. So credibility basically argues that you've done your homework, and I'm going to use this term very loosely, are objective about this issue that you're persuading. And ultimately that I can trust you to be a well-informed individual on what you're persuading me about. So again, we're going to move away from the small things in life where, you know, let's do sushi tonight. You know, I don't know whether I'm going to be credible on that or not. But we're going to move to kind of major issues you're trying to mobilize individuals on. So if you haven't been a fan of Shark Tank, I would encourage you to go and watch some Shark Tank. So Shark Tank is the ultimate place to study persuasion. And after a brief 1-minute pitch, you'll realize it goes straight into a conversation, mostly with these killer questions. But what happens in the first minute of Shark Tank is very important because the sharks decide whether or not the entrepreneurs have any credibility. And they're testing them. You'll notice the questions they're asked are, you know, what's your track record? How successful has this business been? What do you actually know about this product? You know, are you knowledgeable? But there's another thing that's happening at a more subtle level. They're deciding whether they like these people. they're deciding whether they're too enthusiastic or whether they have a strike of humility. Are they able to share their weaknesses, which is, of course, potentially why they're there on the show, because the entrepreneur's weakness is the strength of one of the sharks. They're also looking to see, is this somebody I could work with? Can I trust them? Do they seem to be conscientious and hardworking? Do they make good eye contact with me, which seems to show that they're either confident or they're trustworthy? So as I'm describing this first minute or two of a Shark Tank, what you probably are hearing is that credibility is built around three distinct dimensions. The first is your expertise. The second is the relationship and disposition you convey. And the third is the body language in the moment that basically conveys your sense of conviction, which, by the way, could be too much. So many of you have been turned off by the overly enthusiastic pitch of someone at your office. And many of you have been turned off by the lack of an emotional connection, the lack of conviction, the maybe, perhaps, all the qualifiers, which are in the body language. These three dimensions are very powerful. What we tend to believe is that our expertise and experience is everything. In reality, it is very helpful, but not enough. And I'm going to quote one of my, again, favorite change agents. It's another individual, but she said to me, you know, Jay, persuasion is often more challenging with the people I know at work. They've actually typecast how I'm going to argue on most issues before I even enter the meeting room. And by the way, their counter arguments to me are already in their minds before I start speaking. So what she highlights in that comment is the fact that the longer you work in an organization or you work with a team, they start to know how you're going to argue. If you come from a very specific function in that organization, they start to assume, well, that's how people from marketing argue. That's the point of view of finance. That's how everybody from the controller's office always thinks. What happens is then you lose the credibility that you would normally have with your expertise. And so what I'm going to encourage all of you to do is think about something that are called credibility substitutes. So one of these, which is very powerful, is to find people in your organization who can stand in for you, who are seen as more objective or more neutral. You bring them in, or you have them on a Zoom call, talk about your issue, and therefore you show your, quote, backed up by outside experts. If we had a dialogue going in this seminar, what I would do is I would ask each of you to share your experiences around persuasion, and many of the points that I'm making right now, you would make on my behalf. And I could use you and your experience as my substitute experts. If I wanted, I could have circulated before our meeting some Harvard Business Review articles, some research articles, which basically are arguing what I'm arguing right now. Because they're associated with either prestigious organizations or individuals who, like myself, have a long track record with persuasion, that adds further credibility to me. In your case, you might be able to launch a pilot or prototype. And you'll see that on Shark Tanks, the entrepreneurs often bring the product, they let everybody try it out as a way to prove the viability of that product. On the relationship side, one of the most powerful ways you can get a substitute is find yourself some ambassadors. As a senior person in your organization you don't know well, but your boss actually happens to be one of their best friends. So you ask your supervisor if she could go and spend a half hour with this individual and persuade on your behalf. Key players, you might want to sit down and have lunch with them or coffee with them. Again, through a series of questions rather than through a pitch, get to learn about their perspective. You could help people out before you need help from them. So you want to assume you never have enough credibility. And you always want to assume you need to leverage substitutes to enhance your credibility. Now, the next area I mentioned is common ground. And common ground occurs literally in the first minute when you're describing the initiative or request you're making. So this minute is absolutely key because it has to show your listeners, your stakeholders, how this issue is actually relevant to them. I can't tell you how often I've seen champions of new ideas fail to do this well in the first minute or two. And as a result, they lose the support that they need. And I'm going to use a term that some of you have read about called framing. And it's a term we use in decision making, where the way in which you describe an issue is its frame. So one of the exercises which I would ask a class to do is come up with a couple frames as to why dogs are the ideal pet. I could then ask the other half of the class to come up with a couple frames as to why cats are the ideal pet. So some of you in our audience today love to travel. And so for you, a cat is the perfect pet. And the frame I would use with you is it's a low maintenance animal. You could actually potentially, if you have gotten accustomed to leaving outside, or it can rest in the garage through a little porthole, and maybe a friend can come over once a day to feed that cute little cat of yours. But it's really the perfect animal if you travel a lot and you don't want your heart to be tugged too hard. Dogs are the perfect pet. I'd use a very different frame because they love you unconditionally. I mean, who doesn't want to come home to something that is just smiling and full of energy and just delight to see you? So depending on who you are and what you're looking for from a pet, I will use different frames. I'm going to share with you a couple of videos, short advertisements that were done to illustrate this idea of common ground. And it's in a field that has had no success up until the 21st century. And these were anti-smoking ads for teenagers. So everyone will remember in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, ads to convince adolescents not to smoke usually showed an elderly man or an elderly woman literally on their deathbed, barely able to speak, and saying something like, "Please don't smoke. This is what's happened to me." Well, what do we know about those ads? Well, they actually had zero impact on teenagers. They literally had no impact whatsoever. And I think you all know why. It's because teenagers, one said, well, that person's quite elderly. Now, from our perspective, they weren't, but they were probably pretty close to dying anyway. Again, that's a little bit of facetious humor. The other thing was that they said, well, I can quit before that happens. And I haven't noticed any dire outcomes in the short term. So I'm going to show you 3 different ads. And I'm going to tell you which ones worked and which did not. These, again, were all framed for teenagers. These are not framed for adults. And they were attempts to finally break through persuasively to get teenagers not to smoke.
Over the past 20 years, there have been many well-designed prospective studies using positive lenses to attempt to recover.
We're losing sound here. You may need to mute your audio because it's choppy.
Oh, it is?
Yes, sorry to disrupt your,
Yeah, unfortunately, the audio is just on my computer. Was it breaking up? Was that what's happening?
yeah, it was choppy, yes, breaking up. Try muting your audio if you're putting off.
Jay, was there any words or was it just music?
Just music. There's
Yeah,
no.
then I think we got the gist of it.
Okay, now the problem though is, so I have well, let's try the next one and see if we have that same problem. How about that?
Perfect.
Actually, hold on just a second. Let's lock.
Over the past 20 years, there
Okay, we're gonna go to the next one.
Cigarettes, please. It's not enough. What's a pack of smokes cost? Your teeth. Smoking can cause serious gum disease that makes you more likely to lose them. See it again. What are cigarettes costing you?
Did everybody hear that one?
I could hear it, yeah, but we didn't see the video.
Oh, you could not. Okay, Evan, let me, I think it,
Just try sharing again.
yeah. Do you want to do a replay of that terrible ad? Here we go, we'll do one more.
Cigarettes, please. It's not enough. What's a pack of smokes cost? Your teeth. Smoking can cause serious gum disease that makes you more likely to lose them. See it again. What are cigarettes costing you?
Okay, and this is the final one. Now you'll see that the frames are very different in each of these. This is the last of the three.
Big Tobacco has targeted trend-setting hipsters to sell cigarettes in the US.
Okay, so you have three very different frames here. The first one, as you can see, is really don't follow the crowd. That if you follow the crowd, you'll go off a literal cliff. So what we know from follow-up research on that is it had zero impact. Teenagers were actually turned off by it. It was a parental injunction. It's something you as a teenager used to hear from your mom and dad, which is if you follow the crowd, you get in trouble. And this is a pretty cool crowd. And so that ad had no impact. The second ad, which is a series that came out a couple of years ago, basically argues that your teeth will fall out if you start smoking. And that ad had no impact whatsoever. Again, it's a negative ad. It's all about, again, something your parents or your dentist might tell you, you smoke and you're gonna lose your teeth. And I love to ask my students, because they're close enough to that age group, you know, why is it this ad has no impact? And to a person, they say, well, look, that has actually really exaggerated the impact. And not only that, but I could quit before I ever got to that stage of losing my teeth. So I don't buy that argument either. The final ad is actually the only one that has ever worked in the history of anti-smoking ads. It's called the Truth Campaign. And if you think about it, it's the only ad that's not a negative ad, it's not a parental injunction, and it's plays to teenage identities, which is stand up to the man. The man in this case are big tobacco companies, and they're basically saying they're playing you. And by the way, you can be the first generation in the history of humankind to bring to an end smoking. So it's not only an act of rebellion, but you're going to be the first generation to bring about change. And so it's a very empowering ad. And we know from a series of follow-up studies that it's the only ad that encouraged literally young people not to smoke, and actually it had a fairly significant number of kids who actually quit smoking after seeing the campaign. I wanted you to see, though, I can take one issue, which is please don't smoke. And with teenagers, I can frame it in multiple different ways. But by the way, only one of those frames really worked. And so our dilemma is that as we get engaged around an idea, a request, or initiative, we frame it in our own mind. We're going to take that frame and we're going to use it when we speak to get others convinced. What you want to make certain is that the others, the stakeholders, actually see a direct link to their world from your frame. And in most situations, there are really only two frames that coexist, and they're literally competing with one another. And so the question you have to ask yourself as you go into that meeting room is, what is the dominant frame I'm up against? And how can I persuade the audience that this, my framing, is actually the one that should supplant it? So if we go back to Semmelweis, the dominant frame in the minds of physicians was that germs or disease was the product of this miasma that floated in the air. It wasn't something you could actually have on your fingers called germs. And he was up against that frame. Now, he didn't even possess the basics of persuasion, which would be a clever way to challenge that. But look around and ask yourself, gosh, how do I tackle this issue? Probably the easiest way to do it is when you open with your initiative or request is state the shared problem or shared opportunity rather than beginning with your solution. The other way to address this issue is many of you have different constituents in a room making a decision, and frame your issue so it speaks to each of them. So if you're with a marketing background and you're trying to advocate for a particular marketing campaign, somebody in the room from finance, make certain at one point, fairly soon in your presentation, you speak to the financial issues of this. If there's someone in sales in that room, make certain you speak to the sales implication of your marketing plan. So roughly 2/3 of the situations you'll find yourself in will require multiple frames around the issue. And about 50% of the situations you'll find yourself in require you to start with a shared problem to get the dialogue going before you jump to your initiative or your request. The third dimension I mentioned is what we call the emotional connection. And as I highlighted from research in basically brain research, the emotions are what are first triggered. We then use rational notions and evidence to kind of validate our emotional response. So you need to make a connection to the identities of the stakeholders in your room. And if you've ever watched TEDx talks, you'll see that a few of them really resonate with you. And it's because the speaker is connecting with something that's fundamentally very important to what you identify with as an individual. The other dimension of connection is asking yourself before you begin persuading, what are the 2 or 3 emotions that I need to convey related to this issue? And be certain that you convey those. So if you need to convey a sense of urgency about this issue, ask yourself, how do I convey this on an emotional level? Sometimes it's hard to speak through emotions. And so you can use stories and you can use an appeal to values to connect to people's identities. The final dimension is, again, what we typically think of persuasion, but you'll notice it's at the very end, which is the quality of the arguments you're making and the quality of evidence. Now, in my world, in a college or university, These actually are very powerful. And if you were to be surrounded by a group of professors, they would spend a lot of time looking at the quality of your evidence and the quality of how you're arguing. If you're working at the National Institute of Health, you'd find the same predicament. Some of you are in fields where these will be of less importance, but they're still important. So you have to do a good job on this side. So what is an argument? Well, an argument is a claim you're making which proves your conclusion. And it's backed up with some type of evidence usually. And the reason this is so important is it gives your stakeholders reasons why they should say yes and act on your initiative. I thought I'd show you one more video to illustrate this. This is a debate over whether you should eat eggs or not. So I picked something that probably all of us have debated what side we should be persuaded by. It's a kind of popular talk show called The Doctors. There are two physicians here, Andrew, who has the shorter hair, and Michael, who has the longer hair and his bangs. And they're going to take opposing points of view. As you listen, look carefully at how they're arguing their case, look at the evidence they're bringing forth, and then ask yourself, do you personally find one of them more persuasive? And if you do, why? What is it about the way they're arguing?
Putting in our bodies. The two things on the hot plate today, eggs and coconut oil. And we're joined by cardiologist Dr. Andrew Freeman and Dr. Michael Miller, co-authors of a controversial new paper about our diets, who join us with their findings. Because what I love is, we'll start with eggs. Are they good? Are they bad? Some say yes, some say no. And I love that you two, as cardiologists, came together and we're looking into foods that we should and shouldn't eat. But the two of you don't even agree on eggs, which is fascinating.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. We actually went to breakfast this morning. Michael and I are friends, but we do have different eggs. He had eggs. Okay. I had oatmeal. But what I will tell you is that, you know, the U.S. dietary guidelines for Americans came out just at the end of 2015, and they now say that you should consume as little cholesterol as possible. And the average egg has about 200 milligrams of cholesterol, so that's one right there. Some very large studies and some meta-analyses, which are studies of studies, show that when you eat more eggs, you're more prone to developing diabetes or worsening diabetes, believe it or not. And so it seems that eggs are the most concentrated source of choline in the American diet. And that choline, in some studies from Harvard, appears to be linked to prostate cancer. In other studies, seems to be linked to colon cancer. And there's a whole body of evidence that's now emerging on all the different biomarkers and precursors in choline in particular.
Don't we need choline? I mean, choline is a drink.
Eggs. I eat
some people are going to use choline when they eat eggs. And then maybe Dr. Miller, you can speak to this, because I know you have a differing view of eggs. And so
I have a much different view on eggs. And as it turns out, first of all, the egg whites have a lot of protein and vitamins and really good, but it's that egg yolk that contains some cholesterol. But what we've come to appreciate is that the amount of cholesterol in an egg has been reduced by about 50% over the course of the last 30 to 40 years for a number of reasons. One was the way cholesterol was measured in eggs was not as accurate as it appears to be now. So in effect, a recent study came out to show that cholesterol content in an egg is somewhere closer to 150 to 160, and that continues to improve. It was about 200, maybe about 10 years ago, and it was close to 300 back in the 1970s. But I think the other important point to consider is the egg yolk. So you have choline in there. You also have vitamins, really good vitamins.
And you're actually saying choline in there is a good thing.
yeah, and
I mean, that's what.
Right, so I'm saying choline is a good thing.
And this is where and so continue, because this is just, if you weren't confused enough, now you're more confused. Because Dr. Freeman's saying, okay, choline.
Well, I think it goes back to some of the studies, though, right? Because you can cherry pick studies sometimes, and you can find what you're looking for. And I think there's so much controversy about.
I would comment, though, the choline content in a lot of these foods, you can get choline from lots of sources. This is a very concentrated source. You know, a study out of Harvard, just 2.5 eggs per week raises your risk of prostate cancer by 80%. So wouldn't you want to get choline from something else in a lot less concentrated source?
but there are other studies that don't show the same thing.
I was going
And
to
there
say
are
that I think that's my concern, is because I feel like as physicians, we try to keep up with all of the journals and we read, but it seems like every month there's a new study that comes out that
the
might
big picture is
contradict
the
a
World
different
Health
one.
Organization, right? I see them as sort of the body of the bodies, right? And so they have done surveys and analysis. The last one was of 34 countries, and they show that people who consume large amounts of choline, typically in the form of eggs, have much more cancer, particularly colorectal cancer.
Back to you, Dr. Miller. We'll have a little back and forth here.
Well, yeah, so the egg yolk also helps to improve both our vision, so eye health, brain health, and choline is a mood enhancer. So there are a number of factors that, in effect, promote good health with eggs in moderation.
Okay. So, depending on what side you fall on, again, Andrew is arguing basically the negatives. He goes down the long list of disastrous outcomes you're going to experience from eating too many eggs. But more importantly, he brings in a lot of credibility substitutes. You'll notice he references Harvard studies. He references the World Health Organization. And so he's using this kind of arsenal of credible institutional bodies of research. Our friend Michael is much more down to earth. He's got kind of a little more likable, easygoing personality. He's focused entirely on the benefits. You actually need this stuff, clothing. You start to say to yourself, yeah, the egg whites, he's right on that. And then he introduces this really interesting and provocative point that he loosely backs up, which is that the amount of cholesterol has declined. It was measured incorrectly. So guess what, folks? You're not getting as much cholesterol as you thought. Your life is not quite at the edge of a precipice, as my friend Andrew would argue. So I would say that in most audiences where I show these two individuals, people lean in the direction of Michael. They find him more credible, even though Andrew is using these kind of strong substitutes with Harvard and the WHO. I wanted you to see, though, one is arguing benefits, one is arguing the negative outcomes. So what do we take away from this issue of arguments? Well, a couple tips before we wrap up. Number one, always open with your strongest argument. There's something called the primacy effect in psychology, which is the first thing an audience hears, is the thing they most remember. There's also something called the recency effect, which is the last thing you hear is the thing you most remember. So always say, open with your strongest argument and close with it. And that way you get both effects. Anticipate the killer questions you're going to be asked. Network with the colleagues you're going to face and say, you know, what kinds of questions am I likely to be asked, and how would I counter argue? You have a wide range of sources of evidence. As you could see, some of it is database, some of it is experts from other sources, but you can also tell personal anecdotes, and you have to be a little bit careful with these, but the more people can relate to the evidence you're providing, the more powerful. We also know from research that the use of multiple forms of evidence is more powerful than relying just, say, on one form of evidence like data. The other thing you should know as you think about arguing your case is if you have a well-informed audience, argue the two sides of your issue. Here's why I think we should do it, and here's some of the counter-arguments to why we might not want to do this. That shows you're more objective, but make certain at the end you do show the net benefits of your side over the counter arguments. That's absolutely critical. With audiences that are not well informed, it's always better to argue one-sided. Here's what we should do, and here's why. If you take an uninformed audience and give them two sides, you introduce a lot of question marks, which may derail you. So I'll close with that comment of the limits on your influence, of the limits on your words. And remember these four dimensions, that credibility is the door to a hearing. You never have enough, in large part because we're often typecast as not being objective. And you want to find as many substitutes as you can. Secondly, as you open, either open with a shared problem are open with the frames that speak to your most important decision makers. Third, what is really core to this audience? What do they really connect to? So one individual for the book I'm working on was the COO of Children's Hospital in Minneapolis. And she brought about a revolution in safety. And she set that hospital at the, really probably at the highest bar for a hospital in the US around safety. And she spoke to the deep concerns every nurse and physician had for the children they cared for. So that was core to their identity, and that's how she spoke to this issue of achieving world-class safety. And then the final dimension is, remember, start with your strongest argument, always close with that argument, use multiple forms of evidence, and if you have a well-informed audience, know thy killer questions and argue both sides to your issue. Thank you very much. Evan, if we have time for a few questions, it's up to you. I'm happy to stay around.
Yeah, we have a couple of minutes. A question came in from Mark Schwartz earlier in the chat. How would you suggest our political leaders and healthcare experts persuade people to wear masks, practice social distancing, and take precautions to avoid the spread of coronavirus?
So it's a great question. Here's our dilemma with that. Because it's become politicized, it's now part of our identity. And once people get invested in identity issues, that's the emotional connection, it's very hard to move them away from those. The closest approach you could use is to use very compelling narratives of individuals who have paid a price for not practicing a number of these issues. So you'll see more and more stories coming in the media about whole entire families, up to 18 individuals, where one individual went to a bar or outing and then brought the disease into the family. And then literally everyone or half the family succumbed. I think the other thing, which is very important in this from a leadership standpoint, is role modeling. It's very important to role model. And right now that's very difficult because we have kind of two types of role modeling. One is modeling without masks and one is modeling with. So that's an issue where persuasion has limited impact. I would tell you that politics, because it's built so much around your identity, it's very challenging. Most of the ads you'll watch for the presidential campaigns will simply work to reinforce your existing point of view. They actually are largely ineffective in moving us away from the candidate we have chosen because of this emotional connection that we have to our political point of view and to often the candidate. So I'm sorry to say it'll be very difficult. Evan?
Thank you. Next question that came in through the chat from Lisa. How do we do the work to make sure that people of color, women, etc., can establish credibility without having to lift into the patriarchal white expectations of credibility? And not just credibility, the rest of the stages too.
That's a great question. Well, I think here, and it's a challenging one, and because I wish I had a straightforward answer, so I'm going to kind of think aloud. One, I think this whole idea of credibility substitutes may be a very important area to be thinking about. And I think also this idea of common ground, that finding the kind of shared outcomes and shared aims that all of us, no matter what our background, no matter what our color are, that we all aspire to. If you haven't seen it, there's a remarkable short video of Robert Kennedy's speech on the evening of Martin Luther King's assassination. He's speaking to the Black community. He's running for president, but he doesn't talk about that. He talks about the death of King and the issue that most Americans want to live together as a community and live in peace and respect for one another. So he speaks to the common ground in a very powerful way. And Indianapolis, where he spoke, was the only city in which there was no rioting. So I think it's probably those two dimensions. Evan, those are the extent of my thoughts. It's a really powerful question.
All right, Art Dodd has a question. Art, if you want to unmute and ask it.
Hi, Jay. Thank you. Just more generally on everyday conversations about generational differences, I find every time I walk into a Starbucks, the baristas are less than half my age, and I'm not walking in with a storyboard showing seeking liquid and caffeine delivery. So I'm just, that the generational issues between somebody who's a 1980 graduate and people between the 18 and 29, and just our different views of the role of conversation in everyday interactions, and how I can still use full sentences, and I'm less apt to use an emoji even when I'm texting with my nieces and nephews.
Yes. Yeah, young people, it's such a generational change. My wife and I went out for dinner to a very nice restaurant in Los Angeles, and seated across from us were a group of people who were in their mid-20s. And it was remarkable to watch how much of their time was devoted to photographing the food and then sending the photographs to their friends. And then to our right were a couple who were dating, and they spent about half of the dinner sharing phones with one another. Art. So I think, and by the way, I do have an 18-year-old and a 21-year-old. I do think they do have conversations, but they're very different from ours. And I think the couple next to us at this dinner were a good illustration where the phone becomes part of the conversation. And again, it's something we're not accustomed to. Actually, we would find it intrusive to, showing your phone. But I do think that some of that will begin to dissipate to a degree as they get older. There was a period where I was really fascinated by generational differences. And what I saw is that as generations age, they do start to pick up some of the habits of prior generations. That said, this is a generation that has been raised on the phone, and the phone will always be integral to them. And one of the things which organizations I see now doing is saying, this is a phone-free zone. This is a phone-free meeting. So I think part of it is you and I in encouraging young people not to use phone. In my classes, I don't allow the students to use phones or laptops. So by the way, the students are amazing conversationalists. And I don't think that's unique to CMC, but they all have the capacity. The dilemma is, I like to say we're all kind of wired now for attention deficit with all these tools, and then TikTok and Instagram are taking us even further over the edge. Evan, do we have another question or two you'd like?
It's we have a couple more questions, but we're also out of time. So I would like to conclude at this point. But anyone who wants to stay on and maybe do a follow-up question with Professor Congar, I think you'd be allowed to. Perfect. And a reminder that this is the end of our fiscal year. Happy New Year to everybody tomorrow. Please make your end of year gift at cmc.edu/donate if you haven't yet. I also want to end this meeting on a somber note. Jerry Garris, a long-standing member of our community, a staff member since 1970, a founder in many ways of the Modern Athenaeum and a parent to 2 alumni, passed away over the weekend. So many of you will remember Jerry as a member of our faculty, as your VP for Student Affairs, my Dean of the Faculty at one point. He and his whole family were very important parts of our community, and he will be missed. So everyone, please be well, be healthy. We look forward to seeing you at future events. We have Associate Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion, Nere Gray, here with us on Thursday, talking about where we go from here with the moment at hand. And I encourage you to join us then, and of course at our future events when we return on July 14th. So with all of that, please be healthy and be safe. Thank you all, and I will let you all sign off if you'd like. Otherwise, please stay on. And Brian, the floor is yours for the next question.
Hi, Brian.
Hi, Jay. A big thank you to you. I've been using your book for the past some 16, 20 years.
Oh, Brian, thank you. You're very kind.
You've got me friends in Ferraris and, friends at I'm continuing the Athenaeum Country Club experience in beautiful Los Gatos. Yeah, so, but there's a problem that people are hinting at, that the generations are not exactly interacting ideally. When you go to Starbucks, it is the younger people, and so how can we link those generations in with it's because how can we relate in the era of Me Too, where where we can instill some amount of trust in people. A lot of my friends have married off, and I'm having trouble meeting them. So, and I'm not married, so I'm in the dating world, and so persuading the world really to accept an amount of trust between I would hazard that you're around my dad's age, and Evan's around my age, and Jenna's a younger person than I am. How can we instill amount of trust when people are married and people are in our father's generation, and I'm still trying to fulfill my dad's expectations and get married. Thanks for your.
Well, Brian, in some ways, I'm the right person to talk to. I didn't get married until my mid-40s. I stalled as long as possible. Now, my father got married in his early 40s, so I had a role model. And by the way, gosh, one of the great things is this younger generation. I don't know how many of you are following, but the average age at which now men and women get married is the late 20s. So everybody's waiting, I think largely because of the dual career couple. And then I think people really, as families have gotten smaller and people have invested more in their children. I'm part of the generation of fathers who's actually very involved in my children's lives, whereas my father was part of the generation that was my mother's role. The dad was not supposed to be involved. They're supposed to be working. So that has completely disappeared, I find. Most of us as men are incredibly involved in our children's lives, beyond going to sports games. I think one of the it's one of the few silver linings of the pandemic, is that I think that pandemics like this, or 9/11, actually bring people back together. Now, the irony is, of course, is we're all isolated, so it's not quite happening yet, and it won't happen till after everybody is safe to go out. But I think when the United States or any country goes through a crisis, we begin to see the value of community. And I think the US has had a long period of prosperity where the sense of community has been supplanted by the sense of individualism. And I think we're going to swing back, because we're going to start to realize the importance of community, of having greater respect for the community. And I think the younger generation is, I think they're starting to see in the pandemic, gosh, I could be the one that infects my parents. And we had, I sit on the advancement committee of the Board of Trustees of Claremont McKenna. And we had our 2 student reps on there, and the head of that committee, the chairs, asked for both of their perspective. Good for you, Brian. He said, well, how are you being affected by this? And one of the students, she said, my main concern is my parents. And then he asked her about, what do you think about going back to school? And she said, my main concern is the faculty. I do not want to be responsible for infecting any of the faculty. Those are the first 2 thoughts that came out of her mind, out of her voice. And I thought, wow, this is, even though we tend to think of younger generations as kind of entitled and self-focused, I think we're going to see that there's going to be this really powerful silver lining that will come, which is young people seeing more of the sense of community. We also see it in this election coming up. I think we have more young people engaged in the election than ever before. And you may or may not know, but young voters have been fairly apathetic for about the last 20 years. That's completely changing now. So I think social forces are going to bring young people around. And Brian, wait till you find the almost perfect person. By the way, there is no perfect person, so that's why I said almost. Don't feel any pressure. Evan, you want to do one or two more questions? And then...
Yeah, we have one more here. Someone asked about microexpressions and how microexpressions are a critical part of communication. And with that in mind, are there any persuasion techniques to overcome the obstacles of microexpressions when we are all wearing face masks?
Wow, that's a great question. These are terrific questions. Well, you know, the primary places where microexpressions show up is, of course, your mouth, but your eyes are the other place. And your eyes are not covered with a mask. So actually, we get to see a lot of microexpressions, even though your mouth is covered up. So I think we're all becoming better eye readers. And the other place that is very important is voice. And a mask does not hide, it muffles your voice, but most masks, you can get the underlying tone. Is there a tone of confidence or conviction? Is the voice too strong? Is it too soft? So microexpressions are very powerful, but the problem is they're often beyond our awareness. And so they're somewhat hard to kind of master as a persuasive technique, other than the fact, what I mentioned earlier, which is before you go in to persuade anyone or a group of people, ask yourself, what are the 1, 2, or 3 emotions that align with the message I'm persuading? So am I building a sense of urgency? Am I expressing confidence in this group to successfully tackle this issue? And am I excited about the outcome we'll produce? So we have 3 different emotions there. And you'd want to make certain that your voice tone conveyed those 3 emotions. We know you, so we know when you're urgent, have a sense of urgency. You don't need to be exaggerated in that tone. But generally speaking, if you have a sense of urgency, you speak more rapidly, you speak at a stronger pitch, for example. So the other thing you can do is kind of, again, using the emotions you wish to convey, go in front of a mirror and practice those and look at how your face expresses that and look at how your voice tone comes across in expressing those. Because that's the kind of closest way you can get to leveraging microexpressions. But again, it's challenging because many of them are outside of our consciousness. Thank you all. It was wonderful to see you even at a distance.
Thank you, everyone.
I hope you have a great, great summer. And I look forward to seeing you back at our campus for your reunions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. Everyone, feel free to unmute and say hello, goodbye. Appreciate everyone. Thanks for being here.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
You're so welcome.